McNeill Whistler was one of the leading painters of the 19th century. A highly diverse artist whose work spanned a wide variety of media, from oil paintings to watercolors to pastels to etchings. He was known for both uniquely beguiling tonal works and portraits, most notably his 1871 arrangement in gray and black, number 1, commonly known as Whistler's Mother. But Whistler was much more than just a painter. A renowned wit who regularly rubbed shoulders and crossed swords with Oscar Wilde, and famously sued the hugely influential artist and critic John Ruskin for a scathing review of one of his paintings. Whistler was known to be as prickly a public figure as he was an eminently elegant stylist. Most significant of all, perhaps, he was a passionate advocate of an aesthetic theory that emphasized art's strict independence from any form of social utility, a philosophy he spelled out in vividly poetic detail in his 1885 10 o'clock lecture, the subject of Whistler specialist Linda Merrill's latest book, making her the ideal guide to shed light on Whistler's overriding commitment to beauty. Linda Merrill, welcome to Exploring Art History.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
This conversation is about your most recent book, The Performance of Art, all about Whistler's 10 o'clock. And I won't even say 10 o'clock lecture because he didn't say that, so I'll just call it the 10 o'clock. It's a little bit confusing because obviously we're just beginning, so we haven't gone into any details, but I'm curious to know what led you down the path of being interested first and foremost about Whistler himself, because that's something that you've thought long and hard and written many things about. Whistler and his work and his contemporaries and his influence and his aesthetics and all the rest of that. So I'm interested to know how you moved into that direction and what your motivations were. And then I'd like to veer to the 10 o'clock and ask specific questions about your motivations for this most recent work.
Mm-hmm. I became interested in Whistler when I was in college, and I paid a visit to the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, which has the largest and the best collection of works by Whistler. And I just fell for his art. I just thought it was the most beautiful art I had ever seen. And went back to college and found a course to take on Victorian painting where I could study Whistler and do an in-depth study, a paper about him. Then I went to England for graduate school to the University of London on a Marshall Scholarship. And I was interested in art and literature and the crossover that was so common in the Victorian period of art and poetry. And somehow or other that led me to Whistler and Ruskin and the Whistler-Ruskin libel trial of 1878, which became the topic of my dissertation. When I returned from England, I happily got a job at the Freer Gallery of Art, dream job. And so for about 15 years, I was there working with this very fine collection of works by Whistler and just got deeper and deeper into his art and his aesthetics. And of course, the 10 o'clock was always part of what I knew about Whistler, the way that I understood Whistler. But while I was a curator, I was more interested in the works of art themselves than in the theory behind them.
Sure. If I can just probe you a little bit, when you said you fell in love with his art and you were captivated by his art, so what was it exactly that particularly appealed to you, that particularly resonated with you about his art?
Well, I especially love the nocturnes, the paintings mostly of the River Thames at night. They are tonal paintings, so the palette is very narrow, and it just appealed to me greatly how he could produce such a lyrical effect in those paintings with so little paint. The canvases are practically stained, and there's very little detail, and yet looking at them, you just become absorbed in that vision of the foggy Thames at night. And I'd just never seen anything quite like that. That really appealed to me. And then I discovered that he'd done lots of other things. Of course, the portrait of his mother, which has sort of determined his reputation, is kind of an outlier. It's not exactly like the rest of his paintings, but he became known for his portraits as arrangements of line and color. And so there's an underlying aesthetic that ties them together, even though they look very different.
Yeah. I was wondering, because most people, myself very much included until about a week ago, didn't know very much about, well, I should say most people don't know very much about Whistler, other than the famous painting of his mother. Perhaps our circles are different, so maybe when I say most people, you'll push back a little bit on that. But depending on how one defines most people, that's certainly his most famous work, for better or worse, right now. And I was wondering if you could perhaps just sketch out very briefly his biography, and focusing upon those literary interactions that will, of course, play such a strong role in the book that you've just written.
Mm-hmm. He was born in the industrial town of Lowell, Massachusetts, and he was never very proud of that and tended to obscure his origins, sometimes saying he was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he did go as a child when he was 9 years old. His father, who was a civil engineer, was called by the Tsar to build the railroad between Moscow and St. Petersburg. And so Whistler, for several years, lived like a little prince on the banks of the Neva, and that contributed to his sense of himself as a kind of aristocrat, of a very special person, and a privileged person. His father, unfortunately, died in a cholera epidemic, leaving the Whistlers with very little money. So they went back to New England. Whistler didn't distinguish himself in school, although he continued to practice art. He had been enrolled in the Royal Academy in St. Petersburg, so he had received some formal training when he was a teenager. And then he went to West Point in the family tradition and pursued his art there as much as he could. He learned to etch, which would be a very important skill for him, but he wasn't much of a cadet, and accumulated many, many demerits and was eventually expelled. He went to work for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Society in Washington, and again used his skills in map making and etching. And then as soon as he turned 21 and came into a small inheritance from his father, he went to Paris, where he had always wanted to go, sort of in the vanguard of the American artists who went to Paris to study in the 19th century. So he arrived in 1855. This was a time when Gustave Courbet was just becoming known. It was a very exciting time to be in Paris. So exciting that Whistler ignored his studies pretty much, any formal education while he was in Paris, but he sketched endlessly, he made etchings, he began to practice painting, just not in the formal academic sense. And he spoke French fluently because he had grown up in St. Petersburg, so he fit into the bohemian climate of Paris very easily, made lots of friends in all realms of the arts, and many of them he continued to know throughout his life. So he stayed in Paris for many years, began to exhibit his works, but went to London frequently because his half-sister Deborah Hayden lived there. So he would go and sort of recover from his bohemian life in her very middle-class household in Sloane Street. And her husband was a physician, but also an amateur artist and a collector of prints. And it was from his collection that Whistler really got to know the works of Rembrandt, for instance, and began etching much more seriously. And the time he spent in London led him to understand that there was money to be made in London, that artists did very well there. There was less competition than he found in France. And so he decided to settle in London rather than in Paris, although throughout his life he went back and forth between the two cities. It was probably a wise decision. I'm not sure he could have distinguished himself in Paris as quickly as he did in London, and yet London was extremely conservative. And it was also an extremely verbal culture. The English were readers more than they were sensitive to the fine arts, and they liked art that reflected what they read. In other words, they wanted paintings that were illustrations. And that was exactly what Whistler didn't want to do. Initially, he was a realist, so he wanted to paint the world around him, and the grittier, the better. So he became very attached to scenes on the East End of London, the docks, and shipping. Not really the nicest people that he was depicting, and certainly not what people expected to see in works of art in London. So he started out as a realist, like Courbet, determined to paint the modern world as he saw it. But gradually he moved away from that. He never wanted to be associated with a single artist. He always wanted to assert his independence. And gradually he moved toward aestheticism, or the idea that art should be able to stand on its own, should not be attached to literature, and should, above all, aim to be beautiful. And realist paintings were interesting, but they weren't beautiful. And so he worked more and more to introduce elements of beauty into his works, and found inspiration for that primarily in the art of China and Japan. And there was a lot of blue and white china in London at the time, and more coming into Amsterdam and Paris. So he became a collector of blue and white porcelain. And he was interested in it not so much for the shapes, but for the actual paintings on the vessels. And at about the same time, he discovered Japanese woodblock prints and a new way to compose paintings that moved him away from realism and into something that was much more formally beautiful, very foreign to the eyes of the British especially, but much more in keeping with his notion that art should be distinguished by color, form, and line, and not by its subject matter.
Wow. Had you prepared all of this? I mean, I realize that you're a specialist and you've also done a lot of curating and all that, but that was a pretty remarkable extemporaneous summary. Um, so I'd like to follow up with a few questions, and some of them are more significant than others. So one anecdote that came to my attention first through your book and then through subsequent reading is that there is this idea that he was expelled from West Point, and many say it's apocryphal, because he was asked a question about silicon, and he said that silicon is a gas, and then which of course it isn't, and then later said, "Were silicon a gas, I might be a general one day." I thought that was a lovely anecdote, but I'm guessing it was probably apocryphal.
I don't think you get expelled from West Point for failing one exam. I think he probably failed the exam, whether it was that question or not that did it. But he had plenty of other demerits. He didn't show up anywhere on time. He had problems keeping his uniform tidy. He just wasn't cut out for the military. And that even comes up in the 10 o'clock. He even sort of explains himself in that he just wasn't a man made for the military. He was an artist, and he always knew he was an artist, and he should never have been at West Point. He was just there to satisfy his mother. He may have even engineered it all to be expelled. He may have realized by then that he was never going to be an officer and that he needed to get out of there.
Yeah. Another thing that occurred to me when I started learning a little bit more about this is that it's true he had these experiences as a youth in the I can't remember what it was, the Imperial School of Design or what have you in St. Petersburg. But by and large, this seems to have been somebody who was effectively self-taught. I mean, he did so much of the work on his own. And even, as you say, his development when he first went to Paris and then was exposed to different work in London and so forth. I mean, this is someone who, is it safe to say, it seems to me to be the case, that he didn't have a tremendous amount of formal training, and he was really learning both from his own experiences and the experiences of people close to him. Would that be a fair summary?
That is a fair summary. He began to regret it in the 1860s, as people often do when they haven't taken their studies seriously and suddenly they're in this profession and they feel ill-prepared. And in the late 1860s, he began a serious period of self-education where he was drawing from models, sort of classical drawing, doing the kinds of things that he would have done if he had had an academic education. He was especially concerned about his drawing because he went straight into painting, which you don't do in academic training. And so he sort of tried to re-educate himself. That's when he was working closely with Albert Moore, who's an artist who's pretty much forgotten today, certainly in the United States, but was a well-known painter of classically draped figures at the time. And the two of them worked together, and I think Moore helped Whistler a lot in becoming more comfortable with the human figure, especially. I think eventually he realized that just wasn't going to work for him. Maybe it was too late for him to pick that up. Maybe it's just not where his interest was. He continued to paint the human figure. Certainly, he's very well known for his portraits. But I would say his real contribution to Western art lies probably more in his landscapes, in his nocturnes, the works that are closer to abstract paintings.
And then, speaking of that, maybe this would be a good opportunity. You mentioned, I think, just in passing, the libel trial with Ruskin, but maybe you can give a little bit of background about that. And of course, that was generated from Ruskin's comment on one of the nocturnes. And then I hope to get to Wilde a little bit. So I'm not... Apologies for relying upon you as a bit of a extemporaneous dictionary or encyclopedia, or I don't even know if those words are familiar to people anymore these days. But I do think it's important to provide the cultural backdrop before we actually get into the lecture. So if you can talk a little bit about that, because of course that played such a, not only a formative role in his life, but also was, I think, quite revealing in terms of not only his particular beliefs vis-a-vis Ruskin and others, but also the prickly nature of his personality, which I think you've alluded to, but only a little bit, in terms of he felt a little bit like an aristocrat because of his circumstances, but he was not the easiest person to get along with, I think can be safely said. So it would be good to, I think, talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, he wasn't easy to get along with, but neither was Ruskin. They were two such powerful personalities and on opposite ends of the spectrum of art appreciation. I remember when I first found out about the trial, I couldn't believe that it had really happened, because it was like something someone would make up to demonstrate the different attitudes in the Victorian art world. And what happened is that there was a new exhibition venue in London called the Grosvenor Gallery that opened in 1877. And it was seen as an alternative to the Royal Academy, where, of course, you had to submit works to a committee to be accepted. And Whistler had been refused many times at the Royal Academy. The last time he had exhibited anything was the portrait of his mother in 1872, and it just barely was accepted. And he always resented that. So he had stopped exhibiting at the Royal Academy, had staged an exhibition of his own works, but was really looking for a place in London to exhibit his art. And the Grosvenor Gallery was the answer to that, because it was founded by a private individual who did not have a committee, but invited artists to exhibit there, and to exhibit a number of their works in a group, so that Whistler could really demonstrate his achievement at the Grosvenor Gallery. He exhibited half a dozen works there. And one of them was the Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, now in the Detroit Institute of Arts, which was probably the most difficult of the paintings that he had done, the most abstract. Someone might have advised him not to exhibit that in this particular venue, that it was going to be difficult for people to accept. But it's a remarkable painting, and it demonstrated everything that he believed about art. It's a painting that's about the evanescent, the ephemeral, the momentary, and therefore the modern. To Ruskin, that meant that it was not a subject worth painting. It was fireworks. It was trivial. It wasn't lasting. There was no message. It had no moral fiber. There was nothing about fireworks that made it a reasonable subject for art. And not only were these fireworks, but they were fireworks over Cremorne Gardens, which was an amusement park of dubious reputation. But Whistler exhibited it, along with other nocturnes that were easier to appreciate, and a few portraits, some of which were not quite finished. So it was a mixed group that he exhibited at the Grosvenor Gallery. Ruskin had, for many years, been considered the leading authority on art in Great Britain. And he could make or break an artist's reputation with one review, and everyone knew that. He had pretty much created the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or created their fame and their reputation. And by the 1870s, Pre-Raphaelitism was no longer new, but the Pre-Raphaelite approach was firmly ingrained in British art, which is to say that artists would paint nature without selection, paint exactly what they saw, and often in paintings that were essentially illustrative. So you can see how very different that is from the Nocturne in Black and Gold, where there was absolutely no story that you could find, and there couldn't be any detail. You could hardly tell what was going on. You could vaguely see figures in the dark, but basically it was an abstract painting, which is how Ruskin saw it. This was before the word abstract was used in art criticism. So there was no way to talk about abstraction, which is one reason Whistler came up with musical nomenclature, because it was a way to approach that idea of painting that didn't have a subject. Now, that's not true of everybody. There certainly were people who understood what was going on in a painting like this, and there were critics who were able to write about it reasonably. Whistler always liked to pretend that absolutely nobody understood his art, which was never true. He always had some positive criticism. But I think for someone like Ruskin, there was nothing to see here. And of course, Ruskin was always looking for a moral message, and there certainly was none of that. So Whistler was not a non-representational artist. That's not going to happen until Kandinsky. He didn't ever get there. But the fact that he gave his paintings these double titles, Nocturne in Black and Gold, which was supposed to tell you how to approach this work. It was a nocturne, which is to say that it was musical, and what was important about it was not subject matter. Black and Gold, you were to look at it to appreciate the very narrow spectrum of color in this work. And then the subtitle, The Falling Rocket, was a way to sort of direct your attention to the site of the painting and gave you another way to approach it. But he was getting close to abstract art, but he never got there all the way. But neither did Picasso. Picasso always kept some subject matter in his painting. It was a long time before art became purely abstract, like Rothko.
You alluded to this before, but it's perhaps worth emphasizing in light of what's to come. Ruskin was famously oriented towards not just his perception of the beautiful, but his perception of the beautiful from a moral and utilitarian perspective, that art is supposed to be elevating people and elevating society and contributing to the moral good and so forth and so on. And whether or not you think this is a completely intelligible description of a falling rocket as part of a fireworks display, that very topic, presumably, is not a topic that, however it's painted, that Ruskin would be overly sympathetic towards. Would it be fair to say that?
It would be fair to say that, yes. To Ruskin, this is not art. It's
Right.
not fulfilling any of the functions of art as he sees it. And the thing about Ruskin was that he had a very strong sense of what was right and what was wrong. Everything was black and white with him. And this just fell outside the realm of, of art. He didn't know Whistler personally. He'd never met him. If he had, he wouldn't have liked him, I don't think. That might have made it even worse. But he was criticizing this painting purely on the basis of a lack of any moral concern, any utility, any clarity. Now, another thing that may have entered into that is that Ruskin, as you may know, was the great champion of Turner. And a lot of people compared Whistler's and Turner's works, in that Turner's works also veered toward the abstract, especially in his later works. And Turner also was a colorist, as Whistler was, so that the line began to dissolve in atmosphere in Turner's works and Whistler's works. And I think Ruskin was aware of that and absolutely could not countenance that. He could not see that Whistler and Turner could possibly have anything in common. And he may have worried that people would mistake Whistler's art as a development of Turner's. And he couldn't stand that. So he had to kind of shut Whistler down as much as he could.
Yeah.
And as early as the first time he had an opportunity.
Another comment is you mentioned the result of the libel trial, which is that Whistler won, but he won a farthing, which is a overwhelmingly inconsequential amount of money, if I could put it like that. But it's probably also worth mentioning at this point that that wasn't just irritating to Whistler. He was having very significant financial troubles of his own at that point. So maybe you can speak just a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, he was always having financial troubles. Whistler was never really financially secure, maybe in the very last years of his life, but certainly not in this period. He had just spent a year working on a decoration for the decoration of a dining room in the home of Frederick Leyland, who was a shipping magnate from Liverpool, whose new London house needed decoration. And so Whistler had stepped in to decorate the dining room into what is now the Peacock Room in the Freer Gallery of Art, or the National Museum of Asian Art, part of the Smithsonian in Washington. It's a remarkable decoration in every respect. It began as a kind of small touching up of the work of another artist, and Whistler then became more and more absorbed in the decoration and spent months working on it and making it as beautiful as he possibly could. He had great respect for this patron. He was very fond of his family. He really was trying to create a masterpiece. But Leyland, who had been in Liverpool while Whistler was working on it, came back to London, saw it, and did not sufficiently appreciate what Whistler had done in the room. It wasn't quite finished, but Leyland did not appreciate it and felt that Whistler had overstepped, and Leyland refused to pay what Whistler demanded. So Leyland said, finish up and get out. Leyland went back to Liverpool, and Whistler did finish the room, including putting a magnificent mural on a wall that had been reserved for a painting by Whistler that Whistler had now determined never to give to Leyland. And it was a mural of two peacocks, two fighting peacocks, who represented Leyland and Whistler titled it Art and Money, to show that it was a fight over money between the patron and the artist. Not only did he not earn much money from painting the Peacock Room, but he hadn't been able to paint anything else during that time. It was a year of his life when he hadn't produced other works. And this was just before the Grosvenor Gallery exhibition, which is why the works that he showed in that exhibition were works that he had done years in the past. Nothing brand new. So he really did need the money, and he must have realized that Ruskin's critique was going to make his prospects even worse. It was published in a fairly obscure journal of Ruskin's own called For His Clavigera, And if Whistler had left it alone, it's possible that it would not have been repeated and reprinted, and it might not have damaged his reputation. But there were newspapers who would pick up on the most outlandish of Ruskin's statements and reprint them. And so that might have happened also. So Whistler really felt that he needed to earn some money, and felt that if he could earn substantial damages from this case, it could make up for the time he had spent in the Peacock Room. But of course, that didn't happen, and he had to pay his lawyers. There was almost immediately a campaign to raise money for Ruskin, who did not need money. But there was a campaign to raise money to pay Ruskin's costs. And that was all very painful for Whistler. Fortunately, he got a commission from the Fine Arts Society to go to Venice for a few months and produce etchings of Venice, which were bound to be popular, largely because Ruskin had popularized Venice as a subject for art. And that ended up being a very consequential period of Whistler's life, that he not only made astonishing etchings, far more than had been commissioned, but also pastels and watercolors and paintings. That ended up being a very important thing for him to do and to really sort of set the course for the rest of his career. But he was very, very poor.
Yeah. And the one other point that I wanted to make was that there was another notable figure who was at that showing in the Grosvenor Gallery that led to the libel suit, which was Oscar Wilde. And I'm sure you're capable of doing this. I'm sure you're capable of speaking about this for another half an hour, but I want to curtail that. But just give me a sense of the dynamics between Wilde and Whistler in terms of their initial friendship and encounters that led up to the 10 o'clock and then perhaps a little bit beyond, but maybe we don't even have to go beyond, but just that dynamics, because of course they were through those very odd, murky beginnings when, as I understand it, Wilde gave a somewhat underwhelming review of that, but then nonetheless they did become friends, if not intimates, at some point, although it was always a little bit tempestuous, as these relationships tended to be. But they were close, and then they became very much not so close. So perhaps you could just sketch that out before we start getting into the lecture itself.
Well, it's an interesting coincidence that Wilde went to that Grosvenor Gallery exhibition in May of 1877. He was still an undergraduate at Oxford. He actually had been rusticated, which means he couldn't go back to the university for a term because he had been late showing up for the term at the beginning. So he had to do something. He was in London. He managed to get tickets to the Grosvenor Gallery, which was the great event of that spring. He was there along with Ruskin. He knew Ruskin because he had studied at Oxford with Ruskin. And chances are he knew what Ruskin was going to say. He certainly would have known that Ruskin was going to praise Burne-Jones, and that almost automatically meant that he was going to malign Whistler. And Wilde did the same thing. Nothing that he said in that review is particularly original. It's kind of witty. It's a little bit funny. He says, that Whistler's paintings are worth looking at about as long as you would look at a firework, a few seconds at a time. But that review was published in the Dublin University magazine, and it is highly unlikely that Whistler ever saw it. The review intimates that Wilde spoke to Whistler, said something to him about the Peacock Mosaic in Ravenna, which Whistler evidently was not aware of. But there's no evidence that Whistler took any notice of Wilde or ever in the future realized that he had ever met him at the Grosvenor Gallery. So it's an incident. It's an interesting coincidence, but it certainly wasn't the beginning of a relationship between them. After Wilde graduated from Oxford, he didn't really have anything to do, but he went to London to try to find something. He wanted to become famous and rich. he was a bit of a poet and a writer, but he had tried this art criticism, decided maybe it wasn't for him. The trial may have had something to do with that. He might have made him worry about what he said about artists. So he got to know people in London. He was very charming, very charismatic, and it was inevitable that he would get to know Whistler. They certainly moved in the same circles. And Wilde recognized that Whistler was an important figure and an important person to know. Whistler was 20 years older than Wilde. And although his reputation was in flux, he certainly was well known in London, and he had his admirers as well as his detractors. He was also very witty. And though he was a difficult personality and he tended to alienate his friends after a few years, he was great at a dinner party, as was Wilde. So for a time, Whistler and Wilde were often together in the social circles in London. And people loved hearing the repartee. They loved hearing the two of them discuss art or anything else. But it didn't last very long. I think I get the sense that Wilde really started to get on Whistler's nerves, and maybe Whistler got on Wilde's nerves. I don't know. But Whistler began to grow away from Wilde. Wilde also was sort of a charlatan by design. He developed a persona that was based on a character in a Punch cartoon by George du Maurier, which was parodying the aesthetic movement. The aesthetic movement was the popular manifestation of aestheticism, which was the philosophy of art for art's sake that underlay Whistler's work. But the aesthetic movement was all about bringing the public into art, getting the public involved in art. The idea was everybody can paint, everybody can be an artist. You can be an artist even in what you wear. Your clothes can be your art. The way you decorate your drawing room can be your art. And Whistler didn't believe that at all. For Whistler, being an artist was a very rare and specific thing. Not everybody could become an artist. You had to have a certain intuition and a certain feeling for beauty.
And you also had to, well, depending on how one defines art, but you also actually had to do something artistic. I mean, my sense of really the beginning of the end in terms of their relationship, and I'm just going to spout some of your words back to you because a lot of this comes from having read your book, was Wilde's lecture in 1883 to art students, where he presented ideas that in such a way that they were designed to be looked upon as his ideas, that were very much motivated by Whistler's thoughts and Whistler's approaches, and he was almost instructing art students as to how to do art, adopting the mantle of the great sage, when he himself was actually not an artist. And from the way you described it, this was really arguably, I don't know if it was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was certainly something that was more than Whistler could bear at the time. Is that a fair interpretation of things?
Absolutely. Wilde was not an artist. People were astonished by how little he knew about art for someone who presented himself as an aesthete, as someone who had exquisite taste and could expound upon art and beauty. He really knew very little about art. So there's no way that he would have been able to come up with the ideas that he presented to the art students. They were all Whistler's ideas. And Whistler had given them to him very generously. And I'm not sure what Whistler expected. If Whistler thought that Wilde would stand at the podium and say, Mr. Whistler says this, that, and the other. And of course, Wilde presented them as his own. He also presented the ideas of Pater, and Swinburne as his own. Occasionally he would mention these other figures, and Ruskin also. But quite often he would just borrow their ideas and present them as his own. And he had the gift of gab. He could talk about absolutely anything. And it probably didn't occur to those art students that those weren't his ideas. People who had heard him lecture before, that heard the lectures that he gave in the United States, for instance, recognized how different they were. That in those lectures, he talked about decoration. He talked about what kind of furniture you should have in your house and what kind of clothes you should wear. But he didn't talk about art. He didn't talk about esoteric things like the notion of finish in a painting. And that's what he presented to the art students, because he figured that's what they wanted to hear about. And it did all come from Whistler. And I think I agree that was pretty much the last straw, and that Whistler needed a way to take back those ideas, to reclaim them, and to present them as his own, which is what he did in the 10 o'clock.
You go to a tremendous amount of trouble to analyze the wording and the rhetoric in this lecture. So it's not as if, well, here's the lecture, isn't that interesting? Take a look at it. Here are some of the themes. You explicitly spend a tremendous amount of time and trouble to enlighten us on a sentence by sentence basis, providing the context, providing the rhetorical references, and so forth and so on. And I think that's important to emphasize, not just to highlight the effort that you've made, but because that's very much in keeping with what Whistler did himself. I mean, this was not a lecture that someone thought, oh, what are some of the main ideas, and I'll spend half a day preparing it or something like that. He took a tremendous amount of time to be polishing it and repolishing it and practicing it, and not just to be able to deliver it as a good actor would, or as a good theatrical performer would, that too, but also to be carefully examining the implications and the subtleties and the innuendos associated with every line of this. I mean, it was 1 hour long, but it was extremely tightly packed with all sorts of expressions, often arched, often subtle, sometimes blatant, of not only his philosophy, but his enemies and his whole outlook on art. And I think when you hear the idea of a lecture or a talk, or while everybody else was doing it, you might be tempted to think, well, okay, he was fitting into what everybody else was doing, and he was doing a performance, and he wanted applause and this sort of thing. But this was much more than that, it seems to me.
It was. He referred to it as a poem to when he was writing to Stéphane Mallarmé, the poet who translated it into French. And I think he saw it as a poem. I think he took that much trouble with every word and every phrase. And the first time you read it, it just seems turgid and overwritten and over-elaborated, and often difficult to understand. You know, you're wanting clarity in this language, and you don't get it. Just as you don't get it in a nocturne. You have to, if you're looking at a nocturne painting, you have to spend some time for your eyes to adjust. And when you read the 10 o'clock, you have to spend some time to see what it is that he's doing, what rhetorical devices he's using, what allusions he's making. I never really liked the 10 o'clock because it seemed overwritten and overdone. And then I had the opportunity to work with an actor who was going to do a presentation at the High Museum in Atlanta. And it was illuminating to work with the actor because I had to help him interpret every line of it. And it made me realize that you couldn't really do that unless you knew the background of it, unless you knew what the aesthetic movement was, unless you knew what Ruskin's reputation was, unless you knew how irritating Oscar Wilde had become to Whistler. And once I saw all of that, the prose became not only more comprehensible, but more artful. And I began to see it as a work of art in its own right. And I wanted to see how and if it all fit together as a statement of his his aesthetics and his theories of art.
Maybe I'm just too focused on consistency of words or messages, something I've been accused of several times in the past. So maybe there's something to it. But to me, it's the message, at least formally, of this lecture isn't just, well, if you don't like my art, you don't understand it, and too bad for you. There are implications of that, but it seems to me the message is much stronger, which is all of this stuff that you've been told, you, the people, have been told about how you should elevate yourself and how you should be sensitive to art, whether it's through people like Wilde or people like Ruskin or whoever it is who's telling you these things. I've got some good news for you. Forget about all those people, because it's just nonsense, and art will do what art will do anyway. There are no artistic periods. There are no societies that are particularly inclined towards art. You don't have to. You're not responsible for any of this. The great goddess of art will go along and do her thing and point her finger at various different people, and that will happen anyway. So just relax and go about living your lives and have a good time and not worry about that. That seems to me an overarching message of what he's saying in the 10 o'clock, aside altogether from his own thin skin and his own ego and his own desire to be liked and all the rest of that. Those are what the words that I've had to look at very carefully, thanks to you, seem to be pointing me towards. And my problem is that this is internally deeply inconsistent, because, as you said, if that's really the message, that's a very strange message to be standing up and giving people. If the message is don't worry, be happy, it doesn't really matter what you're doing, why do you go to the trouble of giving a lecture about that in the first place? So that's point number one. Point number two is it's inconsistent with some of the things that he's actually mentioning in that lecture. Like the Industrial Revolution was so bloody terrible and led to all these terrible gadgets and depreciation of art, and there are other instances of, Ruskin's terrible, and as the prophet is doing all these things. It doesn't make any sense if, it seems to me, if these people, sorry, I'm raising my voice, I'm getting animated. I'm not getting upset. I'm just trying to put my thoughts in it. There seems to be a contradiction in the actual message, if you take the message at face value. And so I guess I have two questions. The first is, do you agree that there is some internal contradiction within the messages? And secondly, were other people picking up on that? Because it seems like the general response was, well, a lot of people were having a hard time understanding it. He didn't project his voice sufficiently well to be heard in the back row. It was said in this incredibly eloquent, tightly constructed, worded fashion. People weren't poring over the words from a transcript, because they didn't even get the publication until years afterwards when it was published, and so forth and so on. So was there an understanding of the internal philosophical contradiction, as I understand it, from other people? And do you agree with that?
I think some people did pick up on the contradiction. I think they were accustomed to it because Ruskin contradicted himself all the time, right. And we all do it. But what struck a number of people is that he had invited them to this event. He had asked them to pay a lot of money for their tickets, and then he had insulted them and essentially told them what they think doesn't matter. He's not interested in it. He doesn't care. So of course that's a contradiction. It does bother me. But it wasn't. Although a few people recognized that contradiction at the time, most people's response to the 10 o'clock was they just liked the event. They liked the glamour of this late night lecture in evening dress. They liked the fact that he spoke in this mellifluous way. They hadn't expected that from him. They knew him as a painter, but they didn't know that he could write or that he could speak that way. We all know how it is when you hear a lecture. Most of it just goes right past you. You can't keep up with all of it. And certainly they couldn't analyze it the way that I have. One of the things that surprised me is that when the lecture was published 3 years later in 1888, there was very little criticism of it. I would have thought that then, when people could read it word for word and really think about what he was saying, that they would tear it to pieces. And I think he expected that too.
So let's talk about his impact and his influence on subsequent generations, a point that you've alluded to in different ways several times already. And let me begin by asking you a very specific question, which may shock you because I don't think I've asked you a specific question yet, which is, if we were to resurrect Whistler now and say, take a look at what's going on in the world of art broadly defined, what do you think he would say about it?
He would say nobody cares about beauty. You know, that's just no longer the most important thing in art. And it's not that there's no beautiful contemporary art, but that's not the prevailing theme of art anymore. And he always felt that it should be. That's what matters to him, is beauty. And there are lots of different kinds of beauty, and he had very specific ideas about it. But he always felt that that's what the artist should be after.
Yeah. Well, that's what I thought of, actually, when I was reading this. I mean, and that was part of my long diatribe or what have you about comparing and contrasting Wilde and Whistler and all the rest of that. I mean, for all of their dissimilarities, the one key unifying aspect, and even Ruskin too, for that matter, if you redefine beauty in a particular way, is this idea of beauty being paramount in art. And one of the problems that I have, and perhaps that's just my ignorance, but whenever I am confronted with something which claims to be revolutionary or interesting or what have you in modern art, broadly defined, I have that same sense. I say to myself, okay, first of all, this all seems to be, so far as I can tell, so far as I can understand it at all, and often I can't, but so far as I can understand it at all, it seems to have political statements, it seems to have statements about where society should be going, thinly veiled or otherwise, or what have you. It seems to be riddled with opinions of some form or another, but it not only does it seem indifferent to beauty, so far as I can tell, much of the time it seems almost hostile to beauty. It just seems as if it's anti-beauty. And I think, how did we get there? Now, so this isn't, first of all, I think, is that correct? So it's nice for me to talk to somebody who actually knows and get a sense of things, because that's my anecdotal feeling. And that leads to a considerable estrangement from contemporary times. If you're somebody who actually values art and you consider beauty to be necessary to art, and you look around you and you see all these people who call themselves artists and the rest of society is calling them artists and they don't seem to care one whit about beauty, it certainly gives you pause.
Yeah, it's a different definition of art. But there was a different definition of art when Whistler was working also. I mean, it's not that Victorian painting looks anything like what people are producing now, but the idea that art was supposed to make a statement about society or morality or spirituality, that was embedded in the painting of Whistler's time. And he didn't think art should be doing any of those things. He thought art should be a holiday for the eyes. You know, art was meant to be beautiful. And the more beautiful you can make it, the better. And that all those other things tended to get in the way of beauty. He wouldn't have cared if it was in there, if the product was beautiful. But he found that all of trying to achieve those other things impeded the production of beauty. So he was trying to refine his art of all that other stuff. And it's all that other stuff that's come back into contemporary art. We have a different way of encountering art now. We tend to look for that in contemporary art. And if what we want is to feast our eyes on something beautiful, we go to a museum and look at old art. We look at what the dead guys did, because they seem to have been more interested in the production of beauty.
Okay. But this bothers me. And it bothers me in the sense that, so I'm not an artist. So I'd like to live in a world where what it means to be an artist is to be showing me beauty. And I'd like to be shown beauty in a way where I don't have to look at something which is at least 100 years old and maybe a lot older than that. And this is related to something that you said earlier and that a lot of people say, which is, oh, but you're looking at things with 21st century eyes or something when you're looking at these works. Because I think, no, I'm not, actually. Because I don't have 21st century eyes, because I'm not somebody who is intimately aware of and acclimatized to contemporary art now, and thus I have different values when I'm looking at a painting. I don't. I look at 17th century art a lot more, and 18th century art and 19th century art a lot more than I look at 21st century art. And this is not because I'm a chauvinist towards past times and I hate everything to do with my contemporary world. It's just that I don't see anything that I'm particularly motivated to see. Anyway, it's a bit of a rant. It has nothing to do with you. I apologize for it, but it's a sense of frustration that I have, because I think, I don't dress in a 19th century way. I don't talk in a 19th century way. I don't hold that up as the acme of human achievement, that particular time and place. And moreover, a lot of the things that I'm looking at are 17th century or 16th century or 15th century, or I'm looking at 14th century Sienese painting, and I think, wow, this is really cool. And I don't have anything like that experience for the most part when I look at 21st century art, and I find that actually infuriating, quite frankly, and I don't understand why this is happening to me. And do you feel that as well as an art historian? I mean, do you get anything like what I'm describing?
No, I do feel that. That's why I work in the 19th century. Okay. But I think one thing to remember is that a lot of people who saw Whistler's paintings in their own time didn't see them as beautiful.
Sure.
Their definition of beauty was different. A lot of them saw them as hideous and talked about how he just put canvases outside and let the filth from the city settle on the canvas. And they couldn't see them. So ideas of beauty certainly change over time. I don't know that the paintings that we find in aesthetic now may be seen differently in another 100 or 200 years. I just think we're going through a stage when the purpose of art is something different. But yes, I share your view. And that really is why I'm a historian and not a critic of contemporary art.
All right, and my last question, you may be relieved to know, is a meta question. So is there anything that you would like to add that we feel we didn't cover sufficiently well, or that we didn't cover at all, or that you'd like to conclude by way of summation, or anything like that whatsoever?
I guess when I wrote this book, I wanted to give the 10 o'clock another chance. I think a lot of people look at it, their eyes skim over the surface, they don't really read it. And I think we need to give it another chance. I do think it has a lot to say for our understanding of the Victorian culture that produced it. But I think it also, it has some absolutely beautiful lyrical passages that are poetic in their own right and that are worth paying attention to.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful point to end on. I want to thank you very, very much for not only a delightful conversation, but for having written this book so carefully and so thoughtfully and so probingly and so enlighteningly. And I had a great deal of fun talking to you. Thank you. Well,
thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much for watching this video podcast. For more engaging art-related content, check out our Exploring Art History Substack, our short films on our Exploring Art History YouTube channel, and Ideas Roadshow's full-length documentaries. Visit our website, ideasroadshow.com, for more details.